So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Gaëtane Vernat, and I'm the director of the Paraplant Contemporary Art Gallery. Many months ago, to complement our winter 2020 exhibition, Dawit L. Petros Spazio Disponibile, curated by Copenhagen-based Italian curator Irene Campolmi, the Paraplant began to organize a symposium titled Italy and East Africa, Unexplored Histories. This collaboration involved the artist Dawit L. Petros, guest curator Irene Campolmi, assistant curator to the exhibition Amin Al-Sadine, curator of education and public program Josh Heumann, and TD curator of education and outreach fellow Laura Demers. Every step of the way, director of Istituto Italiano di Cultura, Toronto, Alessandro Ugera, and his colleagues have been supportive of this endeavor in many ways and integral to the elaboration of the discussions around this theme. The symposium was intended to take place on Saturday, March 21st, 2020. Because of COVID-19 pandemic and its repercussions, the gallery's closure, limits on public gathering, limits on travel, and so on, we quickly realized that an in-person symposium would just not be possible. As a result, with agreement of all presenters, and I really want to thank them for jumping on board, and moderators, we have reformatted the symposium as a series of 4 programs to be presented online. This symposium is an opportunity to critically examine the legacy of Italy's colonial project in Africa, which cruelly and violently oppressed the people of Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Libya. There is no question that Italian culture displaced local culture. And yet, as Fabrizio Gallanti, the moderator of today's conversation, observed, in Italy, the memory of the colonies is entirely erased from the collective discourse. He points out that the colonies were never addressed in school and that historians in Italy who have tried to lift the silence have often been attacked aggressively by conservative forces who want to hold fast to the myth of Italiani brave gente, literally, Italians decent people, a former historical revisionism that arose after the Second World War, as if Italian soldiers had acted with humanity and compassion in contrast to the brutality of their German allies. But this myth must be demolished once and for all. So this opportunity is serendipitous as we find ourselves in the throes of struggles against anti-Black racism. On May 25th, George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man in Minneapolis, Minnesota, was killed by a white police officer. The context of his death is an appalling abuse of power, which comes after dozens of previous killings of unarmed Black men in the United States, after decades since after the Americans passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and after hundreds of years of systemic racism, which is a terrible legacy of forced colonization, forced relocation, and forced enslavement of Black Africans. Anti-Black racism is an urgent issue in Canada too, along with the national obligation to forever strive toward reconciliation with Indigenous, First Nation, to combat hate crimes against any visible or invisible minority community. We feel confident that today's program and the 3 that follow will help us all to learn about multiple perspectives about Italian colonization in East Africa, modernism, and migration. So we hope that you will join us and invite your networks for the 3 remaining programs listed on the Paraplant's website. So on June 27th at 11, we'll feature a presentation of Dr. Teresa Fiore, professor and Insera chair in Italian and Italian American studies. Modern Language and Literature at Montclair State University, followed by a conversation with Liz Park, curator of the university at Buffalo Art Galleries, who will also be presenting the exhibition Spazio Disponibile in Buffalo starting in September 2020. On July 11th at 11 a.m. again, we'll have a talk featuring a presentation of Dr. Carmen Belmonte, a postdoctoral fellow at the Kunsthistorisches Institute, Max Planck Institute in Florence, Italy, followed by a conversation with Irene Campomi, guest curator of Dawit Petros' exhibition at the Power Plant. And finally, on July 18th at 11 a.m., the last of our four conversation in the context of our symposium will be featuring a presentation of Dr. Girmay Negash, Professor of English and African Literature in the English Department and Director of the African Studies Program at Ohio University, followed by a conversation with the artist Dawit L. Petros. And now, it's my pleasure to invite our partner and colleague, Alessandro Ruggiero, Director of Istituto Italiano di Cultura, Toronto, to say a few words. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Gaetan, and hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon for those who are following us in Italy and hopefully in East Africa. My name is Alessandro Ruggiero. I'm the director of the Istituto Italiano di Cultura in Toronto. You might know the Istituto is is the cultural section of the consulate. So it's an office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And our mandate is to promote Italian culture in Canada, in this case, in Toronto. I must say I'm very, very grateful to Gaetan, Verna, to the staff to the curators, Irene Campolmi, and the curators at the power plant, to give the Instituto the opportunity to be a partner in this exhibition. First of all, in the beautiful exhibition by Dawit L. Petros, but also to be extremely responsive and proactive in proposing this symposium. And Gaetan has already articulated and described the history of this symposium that has been conceived early on as a symposium in presence, and then we decided to move to an online series of webinars. It is for us, I mean, it is for the Istituto, for Italy, I think, extremely relevant to have an opportunity to tackle the issue of the Italian past in East Africa, Italian colonial heritage. As Gaetan said before, and as everybody knows in Italy, the Italian heritage has been somehow, the Italian colonial heritage has been somehow dismissed in Italy and downplayed to a sort of side effect of the war and of the fascism. And in the democratic Italy, it never became really a matter of discussion, and it never really entered the public discourse. Of course, there is a lot of, I mean, in the past few years, in the past 2 decades, I would say, several scholars worked a lot, I mean, and deeply on this matter, trying also, not always successfully, to escape this idea that the colonial past and like the fascist heritage became a sort of battleground just on an ideological level, leaving the facts and what really happened on the ground beside and not really relevant. There was a turning point in this, and I think the turning point was when Italy became the destination for numbers of migrants, and many of them coming from East Africa. And so Italy had to face a sort of historical nemesis of the invasion and the crimes that has perpetrated in East Africa. and the arrival of a number of migrants from former Italian colonies, Libya, most recently Libya, than before Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, forced Italians to face their past. And this, I hope, will progressively percolate into a public discourse that will be more open and more keen to not only to recognize the real facts in the past, I mean, all the crimes that has been committed and so on, but also to be able, and I think this is our major task, to be able to recognize the complicated ties that always remains binding colonizers and colonized. And on this regard, I think I was really impressed by the incredible work that has been done by Dawit L. Petros in the exhibition that has been presented at the power plant. So once again, I'm really thankful to Gaetan and to the team and to the power plant as an institution for putting on this exhibition, and I'm really grateful also for having had the opportunity to be part of this conversation and to be able to support the exhibition and this symposium. I'm sure it will be extremely, I think, useful for all of us. And most of all, I'm thankful to Dawit Petros for being able to elaborate in his artistic practice a theme that is extremely complex. And now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Dawit L. Petros. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessandro. Thank you to you and the Italian Cultural Institute for the support that you've shown this event. It's greatly appreciated. I would also like to extend my gratitude to everyone at the power plant for the work in the run-up to and the mounting of the exhibition. I want to especially acknowledge the efforts of the Education Department, Josh Human and Laura Demers in the production of this series of talks. Amin Al-Sadin has been a remarkable co-curator, writer, editor, sounding board, and untiring support. So thank you, Amin. 19 years ago, as a young undergraduate at Concordia University in Montreal, I had my first studio visit with Gaetan Verna. That I was a student at the start of my artistic journey didn't impede her from treating me with seriousness and with respect. And this ongoing dialogue has been consequential in my development, and I'm immensely indebted. Thank you, Gaetan. The esteemed participants, historians, curators, architects who have been my invaluable interlocutors and are joining us. Their work has provided me with the intellectual, historical tools necessary to clarify the questions that I grapple with in my own work. Sean Anderson, Fabrizio Gallanti, Teresa Fiori, Carmen Belmonte, Germay Nagash, thank you to you all. Liz Park, I appreciate you traveling this exhibition to the University of Buffalo Art Galleries. I'm also deeply appreciative for you engaging me in a dialogue in 2015 at the start of this project, which was instrumental in my get a better understanding of a project in its infancy. I've benefited immensely from the enthusiastic, rigorous discussions and support of Elizabeth Harney for more than 12 years. I would like to thank her specifically. And to the guest curator of Spazio Disponibile, Irene Campolni, I'm appreciative for the artist-curator working relationship that you've modeled for me. And finally, my gratitude and welcome to those of you who are joining us today. And so as Gaetan has pointed out, we're witnessing the effects of colonialism in the brutal ways. It's a living history that haunts and shapes the present. There's an urgency to interrogate deeply and broadly the encounters that have been omitted from considerations of Euro-American imperialism. The struggle over how history is narrated and constructed in the present is not about making singular absolute claims, but the possibility of creating space for multiple voices. I'm honored to have my research and artistic production centered in this mode of knowledge contestation. Italy and East Africa, Unexplored Histories, is not the culmination of this exhibition, but a point along further dialogue and more research. And by research here, I mean more than the act of reading and writing. I mean the lived experience which situates one place in the world with focus, power, and clarity. When one comes from a region of the world, such as the Horn of Africa, Eritrea, that's perceived as a historical backwater, a place either not worthy of scholarly or global attention, the options are to either cynically concur with these assessments and thereby undervalue one's place in the world, or to defiantly insulate that space in a manner that can become myopic and limiting. There are other options, one of which is to, as honestly as possible, engage in a critical dialogue with others who are similarly engaged in careful study of these spaces, not to elevate them in a naive manner, but to situate them appropriately with all of their ambivalence and complexity to their rightful places in history. Spazio Disponibile is rooted in work that began in 2012. This extended into a 1.5 years of travel and research in Europe and Africa, in addition with multiple returns to Eritrea. In the preceding work, The Stranger's Notebook, I investigated stories of migration within the African continent that are outside the dominant framework of movement and how it's narrativized. This included a more nuanced assessment of mobility across the Mediterranean into Europe and how the Mediterranean has been transformed from a space of exchange to an impenetrable frontier. To reflect on the specificities of a particular geographic and cultural relationship that has informed my lived experiences, I turned my attention specifically to the movement of Eritreans and Ethiopians to Italy. This space was further expanded to encompass North America. So there's a geographic triangulation in the work: Canada, Italy, Eritrea, which brings together movements across time: Italian emigration to Canada, Italian colonialism in North and East Africa, and contemporary migrations from the Horn of Africa. The exhibition examines the complex relationships between these African subjectivities, histories, and European instantiations of colonialism and modernity, and specifically how built forms manifest the cultural ideologies of these colonial projects. So the constellation of works in the exhibition, images, video, objects, sound, highlight architecture, infrastructure, and the labors that produced these forms. The work I've conducted attempts to point to the ways in which legacies of colonialism and fascism echo in our present moment. These efforts are driven by my desire to better understand the connections between the historical violences of the colonial project, pre-fascism, through fascism, after fascism, and now operate in current forms of resurgent racism, identitarianism, and populism. So I'm looking forward to the following dialogues. And with that, I would like to welcome today's panelists, Fabrizio Gallanty and Sean Anderson. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawit, for your insightful comments. To echo previous remarks, I'd like to thank our audience for taking interest in this unique program, and we're very excited to launch this series of fantastic talks. A few housekeeping notes before we start. I'll soon introduce our dear speakers, Sean Anderson and Fabrizio Gallanty. Sean will present some of his scholarly research, after which Fabrizio will join him for a discussion. If at any point you have questions for the two panelists, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of this screen. We'll get to as many questions as possible during the discussion. About today's speakers. Sean Anderson is Associate Curator in the Department of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. His second book, Invisible Colonies: Modern Architecture and Its Representation in Colonial Eritrea, was nominated for an AIFC Book Prize in Nonfiction. At MoMA, he has organized the exhibitions Insecurities, Tracing Displacement and Shelter, also Thinking Machines, Art and Design in the Computer Age, 1959 to 89. His next exhibition, Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America, organized with Mabel O. Wilson, will be opening in 2021. Fabrizio Gallanti is a curator and architect who holds a PhD in architectural design from the Politecnico di Torino. From 2011 to 2014, he was the Associate Director of Programs at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal. He was the first Senior Mellon Fellow at the Princeton University School of Architecture in 2014, and currently teaches at McGill University, Université de Montréal, and the Architectural Association in London. Together with Francisca Insulza, Gallanty is the founding partner of the research studio FIG Projects, which curated the exhibition The World in Our Eyes for the 4th Lisbon Architecture Triennale. In 2019, Gallanty curated the group exhibition L'Attente at Galerie de l'UQAM and co-curated the symposium Atlantic Codes for Fogo Island Arts in Lisbon, Portugal. Now over to Sean.
Thanks so much, Laura. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our audience today. I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Lenape and Canarsie peoples on which I am speaking and thinking today. And suddenly, my screen has changed. My apologies. Let me start over. I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Lenape and Canarsie peoples on which I am speaking and thinking today, their elders past and present, as well as future generations. This region has always been a site of exchange through which many traveled, and as a result, a number of different communities maintain ties to the place we now know as Brooklyn and New York. As an architect and curator, I believe we should use this opportunity to consider the struggle against systems of oppression that have dispossessed indigenous people of their lands and denied their rights to self-determination, work that is essential to human rights across the world. And we cannot begin without also recognizing the tremendous, meaningful actions of individuals and communities calling for justice and the cessation of racism in all forms in our societies. This public reckoning remains ever present as we speak today and marks what I hope will be a sea change, not only for the United States, but for all societies in which systemic anti-Black racism is present. Since Fabrizio and I are of the first of this superb series, I must give my sincere merci bien to Gaetan, my grazie to Alessandro, and my thanks to Josh, Laura, Lucy, shukran to Amin, and of course, Dawit. I would also like to wish my compatriots in this endeavor, Teresa, Liz, Carmen, Irene, and Girmay, with whom I was so excited to meet in person, but for now we will just have to live in the grid, as it were. So, Yakanyele and Yamishkin to all. My sincere thanks to the many mentors who shaped my thinking today. I am grateful to reflect on my long stays in Libya, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, prior to Eritrea, in fact, being recently called Africa's North Korea. Perhaps as a forecast of today's conversation, questions I attempted to ask then may emerge when considering the multiple disconnects embedded within the logics of modernism and its colonial underpinnings. And so it has been a rare pleasure to reread notes excavated from very dusty folders while thinking about the work of Dawit L. Petros. In a 1936 documentary film produced by the Istituto Luce about Eritrea, Italy's quote-unquote firstborn colony, and the city Asmara, the capital of Africa Orientale Italiana, or or Italian East Africa, the narrator states, "Questo il nostro miraggio eritreo. Questo il futuro." This is our Eritrean mirage. This is the future. And this was coupled with moving framed views of the city from an airplane. While images and films of cities and settlements on the Italian peninsula circulated among the colonies of East and North Africa during this period, the coupling of an erupitura drawn from the futurist eyes of decades prior with what was later conceived as an imperial extension to Italian fascist power suggests compound meanings for a mirage that is both modern and colonial. While one might commonly assert that the mirage, as that which one longs for in the midst of depredation or despair, the mirage is a projection of cultivated memory. Insecure in its overlaps of the real and imagined, the mirage embodies its own gravitational, optical pull from back to front and never static. Similarly, to conceive of the Italian colony, especially those locations first imagined as extensions of agricultural and demographic resettlement, and now redrawn as cosmopolitan centers, casts Eritrea and that of Italy's East African colonies as multiple exposures, visible structures that emerge, intersect, and recede, unable to be disentangled from their grounding, the imposition of grid and border, from the spatial, linguistic, and economic divisions that distinguish claims to indirect and direct power. The reuse or reconciliation of colonial spaces reminds us of how the fundaments of a Western European modern hegemony was transposed into fragile social ecosystems as a method for asserting domination. A structuring of colonial temporalities in East Africa began prior to the 1890 declaration of Eritrea as a colony and that of Italian Somalia in 1905. Both colonies, however, were not so stridently conceived as physical extensions of the Italian peninsula as Libya was in 1911 and the Aegean Dodecanese by 1912. How might we conceive of the near 50-year period of Italian colonization in East and North Africa as consonant with the forging of images? When considering the built forms of Italian architects and engineers working throughout the colonies, conceptual frictions emerge that complicate how a collective mirage might have been envisaged. Histories of modern Italian architecture and photography are intimates. When a colonial and subsequent fascist aesthetics is deployed as a means of repression, can they ever become post-colonial? It is this precise difficulty for which the reception of images, if not buildings themselves, from the Italian colonies and the world today, that Dawit L. Petros presents in his works. For the artist, the capaciousness of image making allows for a reordering of colonial spaces. One is presented with forms of reciprocity among those bodies that disappear within them. Today, I will be proposing 3 ways in which to read Dawit's works, shown in his exhibition at the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery in Toronto. I will oscillate between images of the East and North African colonies prior to the rise of fascism in 1922, as well as following. So too will examples from the Italian peninsula serve as a backdrop to observations as to how Dawit's works are a manifold of spatial conditions through which an articulation of an Italian post-colonial may be rendered. I'm interested in the simultaneous occupation of spaces afforded by Dawit's images and the personification of quote unquote return to and from the colonies, which I will articulate as a dimensioning of unknowns. For each, the appearance and disappearance of bodies into precarious frameworks signals our own unstable relations to the colonial and its manifestations, somewhere hidden between the composition of a mirage and the fixity of the horizon. So the first is invisibility. The spaces of the East African colonies and its possessions were choreographed for individuals that occupied, both physically and rhetorically, the cities, towns, and buildings designed and built for Italian settlement. Eritrea, Somalia, Libya, as well as a number of locations throughout the Dodecanese Islands and Albania, and indeed Ethiopia, became both center and periphery in a transitive construction. The emplacement of the modern architecture in these territories is as enigmatic today as much for its preservation as it is part of long-standing fascist imaginaries. Likewise, with Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia, and Asmara, the emergence of Italian cities in the early 20th century became as much about negotiating race and gender via the codification of architecture as it did the planning of certain quarters of the cities and their subsequent neglect. The complex assemblies of states and territories in East Africa, and indeed on the Italian peninsula, by virtue of the reshaping of its internal borders through violence and building, was in part both state building and state destruction. Failure within and without of the colonial provides a unique stratum of debate. Behind the veil of its sophisticated near 50 years of modern architectural production, Asmara, as the erstwhile capital of the Italian African Empire, embodies a host of contradictions for an Eritrea that is better known today as a place to escape from rather than to, as it may have been conceived in the 1930s. With a government's near totalizing control on a population without freedoms, refugees and internally displaced continue to pour out of the countries, with many arriving in Libya, Italy's third and perhaps most productive former colony. And yet how such transits both resist and intensify the bordering of nation states throughout the African continent that was initiated by the parceling of lands by Western European states in the late 19th century has been particularly absent in discussions when translating ideas around modernism. Today's movements may be likened in part to the time of Alitalia, the fascist state airline that once transported individuals, including members of various societies, to be quote unquote shown or displayed at colonial expositions in Italy across the entirety of the Italian colonial expanse. With the airline's trajectories centered in Rome, providing links to Tripoli, Benghazi, Dire Dawa, Mogadishu, and Massawa, among others, may all be ascribed to the land and sea-based invisible networks of people smugglers and those escaping brutal governments today. These too are insurrectional spaces through which to engage the lens of Petros, whose images are at once building and dismantling the inconstancy of Italian colonialism. Where and how do we locate ourselves? The photographs and object works in the exhibition point to transits of meanings, of conflicting temporalities, and thus offer views of how the spatial reifies the political. One is reminded of such distances when considering how the transposition of modern Italian values was also a means for performing control throughout its territories. responding to the political agendas and social manipulation of the early half of the 20th century, time as both an extension of the memory of colony and that found among Dawit's works may be read as structural. For both, the framing of the post in the post-colony, or even in a post-truth era, suggests an independence or relative autonomy from subjugation. By extension, in recent weeks, we have seen the dismantling of statues specific to the administration of colonial rule in Belgium, and slavery in the United Kingdom, and now Italy, where a bronze figure of the war journalist Indro Montanelli, despite years of being a site for various actions, stands to this day in Milano. But its days may be numbered. The lingering pathos of colonialism remains. I am also reminded of this when I was living and working in Italy. And archivists and librarians would routinely ask me, "Perché? Why are you studying such ugly things?" And yet, even with the reappearance of such ugliness across the world via authoritarian rule, the afterlives of colonialism are still frequently resuscitated and reconfigured by those willing to declare who, what, and where is Italy, or the United States. Immeasurability. In a 1938 circular written for the Economics Institute of Italy, Renato Trevisani states that, quote, "Italian colonization is of ideas, of men, and of lands," end quote. Such statements are embedded conceits within Dawit's exhibition title, Spazio Disponibile, or Available Space. The title indicates that the continent of Africa, if not all colonial spaces, for many was conceived as empty, waiting for modernity to happen. The redesign and reoccupation of lands that were at once written into the prescription of state and law. To remake the land was to remake the human, the Eritrean, Somalian, Libyan, and Ethiopian body. Colonial spaces were built in as much as occupied. How colonial fascist lives then abutted the formation of bonifica, or reclamation, as we see in these graphics for the Città Nuove, South Rome. This reclamation that excluded some while exploiting others may seem like a familiar refrain. Refocused ideas about labor and subordination throughout the world have sought to emphasize the ways in which colonial spaces continue to shape the work of living. Yet the physicality of these spaces is suggested now not only for their representation, but also for their reuse. For all of the Italian colonies, violence is rarely a relay or a delay. The continuities of the Italian fascist colonial empire were strengthened by privileging the Mediterranean as a timeless medium, assimilating past and present. With its adjacencies, including multiple continents and societies and histories, the Mediterranean may be understood as, quote, a solid sea, or a border, a heavily trafficked space in which thousands, if not millions of lives continue to be lost or disappeared because of government deterrence. For those countries that touch the sea, and even those like Eritrea that were at a great distance to its immensity, feel the rhetorical effects of Mediterraneità, or Mediterraneanness. Such linguistic and visual assaults are recalled when considering the current Italian governments and other world powers' outward disparagement of racial difference. Under fascism, architecture was one means by which racial separation was devised, if not defended, on account of social and moral hygiene. We can thus observe the edges of such colonial spaces in media of the period. These are the ephemera of colony. For Dawit, both the horizon and the sea of images remain plural, diachronic, yet fundamentally centered in networks of seeing indebted to the reconstruction of memory, both institutional and collective, and the documents that continue to uphold their ordering. At the heart of these events are multiple erasures that challenge the transmission of meaning. Whether it is via architecture or land, the image and its construction, one can observe multiple contexts that were deployed through visual and spatial practices that strengthened Italian colonialism. Conversely, ongoing calls for a decolonization of our institutions operates on the question of how to write a history of art and architecture that does not mirror the very same structures that situated colonial authority. To decenter such discourses of coloniality is dependent upon our critical engagement with the measures of failure that continue to inscribe our geographies, our vision, our being. Disappearance. The immensity of Italian colonial spaces found in North and East Africa, as well as the Mediterranean, remains significant for their negotiable identities. At once scenes for aggression, the landscapes were overlaid with narratives that overtly circumscribed individuals' histories, both Italian and non-Italian. By extension, a modernist ethos converted buildings and cities and individuals as images, as commodities, emblematizing an Italian colonial trajectory from the late 19th century to 1943 with the cessation of the fascist government in East Africa. Today, we cannot look away from the millions of individuals seeking to escape from these former colonies, passing through them and into the Mediterranean or Red Seas or the Sinai with the hopes of finding shelter in Italy or Europe. There is a ruthless congruity to Italian colonialism, indeed fascism, that voluble manifestations of the once and former power return in contrasting valences of aesthetics, memory, and the body. The transit of so many inflects our understanding of the formerly colonial, of empire's legacy. One might ask, is there ever a post in the current world? Or is it the bodies that follow these perilous trajectories that assume a currency for demarcating new knowledge? We are ultimately subsumed by and dependent upon mobile economies of seeing. The production of difference was and continues to be essential for the making of colonial power. Agency was all but lost on the subjects of Italian authority, yet the spatio-temporal allocution of the Italian post-colony, indeed the post-empire in certain cases, relativizes the scale for how we might understand the intersections of violence and space. I have attempted today to extricate myself from the photograph as a map, with pinpointing a destination. Rather, Dawit's image making allows for spatial and bodily lacunae to challenge the paradigms of the colony and its inheritances. If we read the landscapes or seascapes of Italian colonialism and fascism as inextricable to structural violence, then with Dawit's disarming works, it is possible to square an interest in an equally compelling transnational aesthetics that undermines such transgressions. We straightaway recognize that embedded within the spaces of former colonies are systems for the maintenance of time as an expression of nefarious authority. Perhaps it is the multitude of lives, both built and unbuilt, seen and invisible, attempting to escape time that reflects the urgency of our deeper engagement with and demand for redress from the misdeeds of power. And it is the voices whose disappearances into these spaces are resurfaced through Dawit's works. Their silences are our measure, our horizon, for which we endeavor to build colonial thinking. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Fabrizio Gallanti, currently based in Montreal, and I have the very pleasant task to interact with Sean about his presentation, which evokes many aspects. I was taking some notes, and one thing that strikes me as an emigre Italian is the inherent contradiction of Italian colonialism. Antonio Gramsci, the Marxist intellectual who spent most of the 20s and 30s in prison, defined the Italian colonialism as colonialismo straccione. And straccione is a term that cannot be really translated into English, that is akin to hobo, miserable, poor, in the sense that Italy pursued a very aggressive campaign of colonialism from the late 19th century into the 30s, while at the same time the country was a poor country that saw a very high amount of immigrants leaving Italy, mostly to move to Australia, Canada, and the United States. So I think I would be interested to understand how and if in your research about Italian colonialism, how much you have encountered instances and moments where you felt that the colonial operation was also an operation somehow to retroactively constitute a national identity in Italy, in the sense that from a country that had been occupied for centuries by foreign powers, France, Germany, Austria, you name them. In the reading of Gramsci, the colonial project was a continuation of the colonial operation that the north of Italy operated to the south of Italy when the country was unified. And so the kind of like rhetorics and the kind of mobilization of a narrative about Italian finally as a powerful force and even a superior race capable of conquering Africa, how much was also like retroactively mobilized as a mean to constitute a national discourse in Italy.
Absolutely. So, thank you, Fabrizio. There are a number of kind of intersecting questions or concerns within your question, and I think the key word that you use is contradiction in certain ways. But before I kind of respond to the contradictions, I think it's necessary also to think about these continuities, as Dawit said in his introduction, that in a way colonialism was ongoing, or the colonial project, if you will, was ongoing from the late 19th century. Fascism happened on the peninsula in 1922. This is 10 years after or 12 years after Libya becomes a colony, and really the turn of the fascist moment almost transforms the rhetoric and transforms the visualities and the structures that began earlier and then are resituated then in a national or perhaps a more national, transnational context. And I think that moment, if you will, that moment of friction that becomes not only spatial, it becomes graphic, it becomes very visual in media of the period, automatically changes the nature of how the colonies were received or viewed or understood up until that point. So the contradiction is intriguing, right? Because what fascism operated on rhetorically was this bonifica, this reclamation of not only the Italian, generally man, this Italian consciousness to be modern and to be of the world. And so it reinforced not only the stereotypes that were perceived of the African continent, but only in 1938, with the passage of race laws, did this kind of almost rigorous separation happen in Eritrea in particular. It was happening earlier in Libya and Somalia, but only when the race laws happened, to my knowledge, did that break really get firmly implanted then in the consciousness. However, I'd just like to say that in my research and writing, the presence of the colonies was very visible from the early 1900s in the form of colonial expositions. And like other European powers, like France and Great Britain and Belgium. And the presence of the colonies and the presence of individuals from the colonies were put on display as a means to, I think, both redirect the Gramscian hobo-ness, if you will, and also to say, perhaps we can now transform these very people through our Italianness, our Italianità. So, like, there are these multiple contradictions that are both internal and external. And what I would say then too is that the linkages, the networks that are visual, that are spatial, that are economic, fundamentally economic, right? The colonies are this space of demographic and economic settlement. Becomes a relay very much between the peninsula and then East and North Africa.
Yes, I have another question, because as we know, in 1917, Lenin wrote his essay, Imperialism as the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And of course, he was reflecting on the imperialistic drive of the Western powers. And one thing that I imagine could be interesting to tackle is how, even if arriving late in the rush for Africa, that was actually really the name that Italy was employing, Italy somehow tried to play the card of being in continuity with the Roman Empire. And I think that any model of imperialistic expansion continues to be, even in different forms, the Roman Empire. So I wonder how much that that actually you see in symbological appearances all over Europe. The French Revolution used this imagery. If you visit Washington, D.C., a lot of symbology of Rome is still operating. So as we find ourselves in a moment of historical revisitation of the past, why not go very well into 2,000 years of history? And I wonder how, again, in your research, how much this claim and affirmation to be in direct lineage with Rome has been operated. I think, again, with the change of regime in Italy in 22, it became much stronger. Rome was really mobilized in quite a different way from before. But I found recently, I mean, because I was making a very quick research, a quote from Francesco Crispi, was the prime minister in the moment when Italy was attacking Somalia and Eritrea, that was claiming a superiority of Italian colonialism because it was tainted by a better aesthetical taste if compared to the French and the English. So there is this quite again, this quite bizarre, if not funny or funky, I mean, from this side of the fence, I don't think it was received in the same way by the colonized. Idea that, you know, if Italy was lacking, you know, military might and scientific power and industrial strength, anyway, the kind of like lingering myth of art and culture and taste was somehow mobilized as a system. And I think that the Roman imagery is not just visual, it carries on values that are still very inherent to the way our Western society are constructed. I mean, our legal system, they pretty much result from Rome. A lot, I mean, the early American slave ownership was, again, finding its justification in the slave system of Rome. So I would be interested to know a little bit how you felt this kind of like continuous re-riffing of the Roman heritage.
Sure. Well, a couple of things. I think if we start with when I was living in Asmara in Eritrea, this is 2000, 2003, 2004, somewhat in 2005. I took it upon myself to find the generation, or try to find individuals to interview. those Italians that stayed, those children that were born in what was a system of concubinage called madamato, and so forth, in order to kind of evidence or surface a narrative that was not only personal and embodied, but one that didn't play into the rhetorics that we might read with Crispi, and even before Crispi with Ferdinando Martini, who was the first governor of Eritrea in the 1890s. And what I found was that on one hand, these individuals, all whom were very lovely people, all of whom I enjoyed conversing with, shared in a moment in history that for them was not only transformative in the way they think, but how they position themselves. So to be able to drink a macchiato in Asmara and see a film in a beautiful cinema that was built was, for these individuals, an extraordinary achievement, because otherwise they would never perhaps have had that opportunity elsewhere, perhaps. And there is a kind of psychological playing out of this building of Rome, or the building of the Italian city in the colony, as what I was trying to articulate as a mirage, right? It's an extension of, but it's a projection, mainly a projection of Rome that then is situated elsewhere. And on the other hand, a number of these individuals would also articulate that they witnessed horrific things and they knew that these were happening, but felt powerless to respond. And so there's a kind of retreat, if you will, into interiority, is what I argue. And in a retreat into the interior as a means to escape then the violence that is being played out outside or externally. So that's one thing. If you then talk to Eritrean immigrants or refugees in Italy, back then, as well as today, I think the relationship with the countries is as fraught as ever. And on one hand, I think there's a fear to critique Italy and its processes and its politics. And on the other hand, that struggle of being Eritrean or being Somalian in the space of the former colonial power, to me, sets up an entirely new paradigm for trying to understand what then the meanings of these spaces might be. And so I think I can't help, and what I was trying to talk about today was this kind of back and forth, right? This reciprocity that is emblematic of, say, the refugee crossing the Mediterranean, or in many cases, after 22, Libya was considered la quarta sponda, the fourth shore of Italy. It was literally the extension of the Italian geographic space. And that was taken up by ancient Roman, description and so forth. So I think on one hand, it's the flows, the negotiations of identity, the negotiations of this geographic space, territorial space, is set up in a way when we look at colonialism, especially in Italy, as actually relatively different than the French or British context. I'm not going to try to say one is better or worse than the other. They're all horrific in their own ways, and they all used horrific practices in order to subjugate individuals and communities. But this notion that aesthetics then is embedded in a colonial project is really fascinating, because we can't then disassociate those aesthetics from the very powers that sought to dismantle and reclaim these individuals.
Yes, I have another question following up on this, because again, I have to be frank, in my very superficial knowledge about that moment, anyway, I came to get to understand that there were different policies between the colonizer and the local population. So depending on the religion, for instance, whether it was Christian or Muslim or the position, there were moments where assimilation was pushed for. And then later in the 30s, it was a radical segregation, if not apartheid, even before the racial laws were implemented. So I wanted to know better where the designs and buildings realized in the colonies meant to be for whites only, as in an apartheid society, whether they were conceived to be for everyone, whether there were differentiation of languages depending on who the clientele was supposed to be. Because if one goes back to the construction of French colonies, for instance, one can think of Tangier as an example. There were clearly an idea of the European city, really like conceived as almost a transplant of a Mediterranean Côte d'Azur system to the other shore of the sea. And then the Arab city was left as it was. So there was clearly this absolutely duality in French colonies. I would like to know a little bit more about Italian colonies. I mean, were there gradients of architectural exercises depending on who were meant to be the users, or was it less organized? Were there strategies? Was it more laissez-faire? Was it left to the whims and decision of the local governors? Was it established from Rome?
Yeah, very good question, because I mean, I look through Dawit's work as a kind of spatial exercise. And so for me, when I was writing about a number of buildings in Asmara in particular, and elsewhere, I begin by thinking about the built environment, because we can't escape it, right? It's built in many ways for us and by us. Therefore, it represents us, perhaps, not as much these days. And for the Italian colonies, it also depended on the colonies themselves. For instance, in Mogadishu, because there already was a major settlement along the sea there, what happened was that there was an old walled city, or a walled city, that was called the Pearl of East Africa for a time. And the Italian city was situated outside of these walls. They had maintained initially these walls. So it was a dense kind of Medina, Morocco, if you want that kind of comparison, space. Over the years, however, that separation between these two cities, depending on where it was located, became either more or less rigid. And that kind of internal bordering that you see to this day in Mogadishu also was played out throughout Libya as well as Eritrea. But what makes, I think, Eritrea fascinating is that you have around 50 years of architectural history and urban history. And a lot of the documentation of these changes over those decades is still present and available and visible. And what you see then by the engineers and planners and architects working in the city, in Asmara in particular, is that struggle between, can we make a space that is Italian? And at the same time, we have to situate where are all these Eritrean people going to be? And those divisions, those borders, those internal separations became even more visible and more rigid over time. And so you can look at the architecture aesthetically and spatially as representative of the political and social ethos, Italian political social ethos at the time, with the transformation of governments. Simultaneously then, you see this pushing away of the Eritrean. So at one point in the 1930s, literally, there's an image that I included where you see the gridded arrangement of tukul. Those are all concrete. They're built by the Italians and forced Eritreans to move into them. And they were kept at a distance to the Italian city. And up until that point, there is a little bit of speculation as to how much freedom of movement Eritreans had. We do know that they had passes, that they had to move from quarter to quarter, but otherwise, and we know that at one point, Eritreans could actually operate business. So they were in the markets, but markets built by the Italians. So I think it's intriguing to think about that relationship between the who is occupying and who is building these buildings, in as much as what they began to represent. And just, the building that is behind me, I am not in Asmara right now, obviously, but is the Fiat Tagliero building. This was built by Fiat. So we had a number of Italian companies, especially car companies, move into Asmara. Fiat, Alfa Romeo built factories here. And the Tagliero building was designed by a young Giuseppe Petazzi in 1938. There's a lot of folklore, if you will, around this building. But to me, it's very much the kind of symbolic engagement with buildings like this that suggest not only exceptional construction skill for 1938. This is a this is a 30-meter cantilever. In as much as it begins to situate a predominantly Italian, white, rational architecture in the city.
Thank you. I have a last question because I'm noticing on the chat that they are quite amazing, and I have to say much better than mine question from the Q&A. Okay. So my last question is the following. So when during the first Ethiopian war in the 19th century, Ethiopian forces defeated the Italians. Right. So the then leader of Ethiopia, Menelik, after the Battle of Adwa, decided a very cunning move that was to basically restitute the Italian soldiers back to Italy, and then instead treat slightly differently the Eritrean allies to the Italians. And the move of Menelik was extremely intelligent because he was very, very well aware that the war in Italy was not consensual. So the Socialist Party back then was very much opposed to expansionist strategies, which I think is interesting because it proves a kind of binomial relationship between colonizers and colonized. We take for granted a kind of like absolutely domination of the colonizers to the colonized, whereas I think also that history is a much more nuanced issue of conflict, alliances, and strategy. So by doing that, Menelik, he was very much aware of class struggles, class conflict, different political positions. And my question is the following. If you read a little bit in the grain of literature emerging from the colonial past of many countries, there were class differentiation also between the colonizers. For instance, if you go back to Marguerite Duras' accounts of French colonization of Indochine, I mean, being a French proletarian in Indochine was quite different than being one of the dominant classes. So I wonder again, in your reading of the architecture in colonized Africa, can you read also somehow the transfer to African soil of the same structure of class division that were happening in Europe? One again can go back to Portuguese colonies, where rural peasants from Portugal, of course, they operated and happened on the land quite differently from the Portuguese military elites in Angola or Mozambique. So is there also a kind of like a differentiation in terms of class, in terms of the structural organizational class that can be read?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I would say that those class differences play out not only aesthetically but also geographically within the city of Asmara. One of the early images I showed, I believe it's from 1905, says the new Asmara, and this is the Quartieri de Villini, the small villas that were on one of the lower hills of Asmara, to which the say, I won't say elites, but the leading members of society, Italian society, wanted to live, because there would always be breezes and etc. So access geographically to these spaces, and there you find this modernism or modern architecture in villas that look, on one hand, like they could be somewhere in Amalfitana or south of Rome, for what have you. On the other, as you approach, say, the main road of the city, on which then I didn't show an image of what was called Viale Mussolini for years. Viale Mussolini was the main road. They used it for race car driving every year for a time. And around that zone, at the center, if you will, is the oldest part of the city to some degree. I'm saying oldest Italian part of the city, not oldest Eritrean part of the city. What you find are these lovely Novecento buildings, brick, elegant, with plaques and mosaics and pitched roofs and so forth. And you could be in Milano. And to me, that's when the architecture begins to point to the who. Who is living here at this time and why? And you can then see that in the processes of changing the facades along Viale Mussolini to become more modern, to become more reflective and flat, if you will, at the same time as this pushing out of Eritrean communities from these spaces. So the planning of Asmara in particular, but also you can see this in Benghazi, before it was destroyed recently, but Benghazi too was structured around these very kind of rigid designations as to who could live in these places. Just to your point about Menelik, it's been thought and discussed that much of the work that was done in Eritrea was in full response to this presentment of Menelik above, right? In the border above Eritrea, or next to, I should say. And that this building of the city was, or its cities, was a means to strengthen then the military encampments in order to position the Italians then to attack in 36 and 37. So that kind of staging ground, I think, is also quite a fascinating component to this.
Okay, I will now proceed to read a few of the quite beautiful questions that we received on the chat, so to continue the conversation. So I will start with one question from Dawit L. Petros, the artist that actually is the reason why we're convened today. His second question of two is the following. In historical interactions between Italy and Eritrea, Eritreans do not appear in, as a European perspective, as subjects in their own right. Therefore, the local Eritrean traditions that inform European modernity are expunged. In this sense, Eritreans are then structured away from mechanisms that shape a specific architectural language. Could you discuss this?
You know, I would say, thank you, Dawit. That's a hard one. I would say that level of erasure that you see, especially in your work on Revista Coloniale, where you see the figure, but you don't see perhaps the structure or the space in which they are operating, was quite common, right? Is to kind of disassociate the body, the Eritrean body, the Somalian body, what have you, from the very spaces in which they might be seen as having lived or operated or have had any foundation in this Italian space. On the other hand, then I go back then to the colonial exposition, in which the Eritrean, the Somalian is always presented as building. They are, even in Monza, up to 1940 in Naples, the Eritreans and Somalians, the colonized from the East African colonies, are asked or forced to build the spaces in which they live, literally. So that the space of building becomes the space of representation and erasure at the same time. And I think that poses a kind of problem, right, for how we begin to resurrect and rethink the voices that were lost, that were disappeared, that fall out of the image of Italian colonialism. And far more important and amazing scholars are doing that through photography, through film, through literature, as it were. I go to one work. It was a diary that was written by Rosalia Pianavilla Vivaldi about her 3 years in Eritrea, in which you can sense in her language and in her kind of experience that shift between recognizing the significance of individuals with whom she was conversant to one of, I have to keep these people away. And so almost the ambivalence, which is, I think, the word that you used, Dawit, in your presentation, that ambivalence and the contradiction of being sets up an entire dialogue around what the colonial city means.
Then I would like to try to gather a series of questions that somehow have, well, actually, Dawit was mentioning also the Angela Maria Cathedral as an example of this dialogue. So there are a series of questions that have, to me, a similar tone. So one is how much is the romanticization of commercialization of such colonial architecture currently playing a role in the tourist industry, and therefore how that can somehow be mobilized about a new idea of post-colonial sovereignty. But also what to do with buildings that they carry a DNA of colonialist and imperialism. So seeing what is now being debated about monuments. And in that sense, I think that, again, Dawit is mentioning the fact that, that UNESCO has attributed a World Heritage status to such architecture in Eritrea. So, which I would imagine is a quite contentious action to do. I mean, trying to have a kind of almost schizophrenic separation between the container of architecture and the content of what has been produced in such architecture.
Yeah. The touristic image of Asmara, to which we are presented quite often, is either the Fiat Chialiero building behind me, or something like the Indomarium Cathedral. Now, I didn't include an image of the cathedral. So there's in one of the images you see the three kind of features of Asmara, religious spaces of Asmara. The mosque that was built by Guido Ferrazza in the 30s. You have the cathedral, which was built in the late 1890s, or started to be built then. And then where that image is taken is from the Indomarium Cathedral, the Eritrean Orthodox Cathedral, which was begun prior to the presence of Italians, but then rebuilt in a very unique kind of hybrid manner to be both fascist and say vernacular at the same time. And even when I took that photo back then, turning your back from the building and looking out, you start to realize that this whole city is a negotiation of buildings trying to assert a certain kind of dominance, visually, spatially, and what have you. And in the case of religion as well, right? How do we situate these things? What's intriguing, I think, in terms of World Heritage and preservation and the preservation of these monuments is akin to what's happening in Italy now. with the occupation of prior fascist buildings. We have the Foro Italico in Rome. The buildings, the city I chose to show is taken by a German photographer in Sicily. These are the Borghi. These are spaces that are, or have been, unoccupied for many, many years, and now are being reoccupied by migrants and refugees in certain cases. It sets up a whole different paradigm of how buildings begin to shape our knowledge and shape our history and how we understand it. So as you said, Fabrizio, you know, colonialism wasn't talked about in your history, but the artifacts, the fossils of this history are ever present, and they can teach us to not look past them. They can teach us something about our history that we may not want to look at. And that's why I said what I said about the archivists. They would, always, every time I would go to the library, why? Why are you looking at these ugly things? And yet, you speak to people both in Eritrea, Libya, Italy, and they would talk about, in a way, kind of, almost a melancholy, not all across the board, but there's a melancholy about the ways in which they talked about these buildings. And usually the word was beautiful. And so when we think about beauty and when we think about violence, or when we think about oppression and structural violence and beauty, it really starts to charge a debate around what should remain and maybe what should be erased.
Fantastic, Sean. Very, there are quite amazing questions in the Q&A, but I'm afraid that we have to get close to the end. And the last question for you, Sean, that I think has been waived at the beginning of the conversation, it's more personal, is what brought you to be interested in this research? What are the roots of your interest? I mean, I don't know your personal biography. I suspect that you don't have either Italian or Eritrean or Somalian or Ethiopian background, which makes it all the more interesting. So what brought you to so deeply be engaged? Because this is not just a quick trend. This is a very long process of many years of investment, of personal engagement. So why did you want to be part of that story?
It's a long story, and it involves my own kind of nomadism throughout the world. But kind of to condense it, I had been living in India for quite some time and knew that I wanted to do a PhD, but not on India or South Asia. And when I began my studies, and I had been practicing architecture and teaching architecture up until that point. And when I began my PhD studies, I actually started working on pre- and post-independence architecture in West Africa. My interest was looking at the relationships between the former French West African colonies and architectural production there, and of the British West African colonies. So I was spending quite a bit of time in the early 2000s in Cote d'Ivoire, in Togo, in Nigeria, and etc. And a number of events transpired while I was living there, including a very serious case of malaria. And I thought to myself, well, this seems so hard. I don't know if I want to suffer through this anymore. I witnessed murder. I was thrown in jail for taking pictures, and so forth. So that's another story, another short story. So I have to say that I was in a course and I was looking through a number of books and found a picture unattributed to what was now I realized was Asmara. And I said, I want to go there. I want to know more about that. And I am completely indebted to the work of Mia Fuller, a professor at Berkeley, who encouraged me and said, well, you have to go. And that was the beginning of this, this long kind of thinking around Italy, Italian colonization, and of course, the East African colonies.
Thank you. That's a fantastic trajectory. I don't know if you and I are supposed to close the event, or if someone else from Power Plant will have the last words. Personally, I think it was a fantastic conversation. I learned a lot, and I hope so did the audience. I think there will be more events down the pipeline. I guess now someone from Power Plant will do the closing remarks. Thank you, Sean, and thank you everyone for. I'm saddened by not being able to transfer all the very interesting questions that arised that were in the Q&A.
I'm happy to read them. Grazie, Fabrizio.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much to Sean Anderson and to Fabrizio Gallanti for Sean's presentation and for a really enlightening conversation. This is there were, of course, as Fabrizio mentions, a number of great questions came in through you, our viewers. I will do my best to share those with Sean and Fabrizio, and hopefully we can get answers out to people. I'll remind everyone this was the first of 4 presentations, 4 programs that would have been a very fecund symposium, but we've reformatted in this new COVID-19 era. So our next program is next Saturday, June 27th at 11 a.m., featuring Teresa Fiore as a presentation, followed by conversation with Liz Park. All the information is on our website at thepowerplant.org. So thank you so much for joining us today.